Yes.
So we have already started discussing entity framework core, and in our last session, we have discussed how we can perform database CRUD operation on a single entity, right? And we have discussed based on the entity state only, the DbContext class is going to generate either the insert SQL statement or update SQL statement or delete SQL statement. So in this session, let us first try to understand the entity state life cycle in entity framework core. What are the different entity state? What is going to happen in each entity state when it is going to move from one entity state to another entity state, and then we will discuss right how you can queries right using LINQ to entities. Then I'm going to discuss what exactly the lazy loading and eager loading in entity framework core. So these are the four concepts that is what I'm targeting in today's session. Let us try to understand first what are entity state lifecycle. See, the entity lifecycle in entity framework core describes how an entity is going to be created, how the entity is going to be added, how the entity is going to be modified and deleted in the database, right? So basically, this entity state describes when to create the insert SQL statement, when to create the update SQL statement, when to create the delete SQL statement, and execute the same on the database. And each entity may have many states during their life cycle. What it means? It means don't think that I'm creating one entity means it is always going to be in a single state. It might be started with the unchanged state, then it might be moved to right added state. It might be moved to deleted state. It might be moved to modified state. From modified again, it might be moved to what unchanged state. Then it might be again moved to detached state. See, that means what? Now each entity can have many states during its lifetime. So don't think that entity state is going to be constant or a single entity. It can vary, right, based on the operations, based on the functionality, right, based on the things what are happening with that entity state might be changed, right? So entity framework core maintains the state of each entity during its life cycle, whether the entity right what are the different states it goes through it during its life cycle. All these things are going to be tracked by the entity framework core, and each entity has a state based on the operation performed by the context class. See, so what operations we are performing on that entity, based on that operation the entity state is going to be decided. Each entity tracked by the entity state as a state, right? Each entity tracked by the DbContext object as a state. And if you go to entity state enum, then you will see these are the five different states that the entity can have. Right? What is this added state? See, whenever you see an entity is in added state means the entity is being tracked by the context object, means the context object is tracking that entity, but that entity doesn't exist in the database. So added state means the context object is tracking that entity, but that entity is not available in the database. And when it is going to happen now, whenever we create an entity and whenever we call the add method of the context object or the dbset object, right? And if we pass that entity to that method, means that entity is going to be in added state. So we'll see practically what is the use of this added state. So added state means you have to remember the entity is tracked by the context object, but it is not exist in the database. Similarly, deleted means what? The entity is being tracked by the context object. The entity is tracking. See, so the first point that you need to remember, apart from this detached state, all these states are going to be tracked by the right in context of see whether it is in added state, deleted state, modified state, unchanged state, right? Whatever it may be, right? If it is not detached, means that entity is going to be tracked by the context object. But what exactly it means related to the database, that is what it is going to be vary. If it is in added state, means it is not exist in the database. If it is a deleted state means, right, it is being tracked by the context object, but it exists in the database. right? So deleted means what? Now the entity is being tracked. The context object tracking that entity. Also, that entity exists in the database. It has been marked for deletion, right? So it will mark that entity is going to be deleted from the database whenever you call the step changes method, right? That is what it means. Means the entity is being tracked, entity state is uh, right in deleted state, but again that entity is also exist in the database, right? Once you call the step changes method, that entity is going to be deleted from the database. Similarly, modified means it is being tracked. It is tracked by the context object. What right? Also, this entities exist in the database. So it is tracked by the context object. It is exist in the database, but some or all the properties of that entity has been modified. Some of the properties of that entity is going to be modified, not all. So it is better to use some of its property, right? So some of its properties uh, value have been modified, because if we modify all the values, then how it is going to update the data in the database? We need some primary key or any identifier, unique identifier. Based on that only it is going to update the data in the database. So this is the reason why you should not update all the values. So unchanged means what it means? It means the entity is being tracked by the context object and the entities exist in the database. In this case, its property values have not changed, right? Whatever the property values available in the database, the same property values are also available with the context object. Detached means the entity is not being tracked. So the context object not only holds the reference to all the entity objects as soon as retrieved from the database, but also keep track of entity state and maintains modifications made to the properties of this entity. Right. So, so basically, what it means, right? If you go and check, so this is my context object, right? So this context object not only track these student entities, right? Students, or you can say standard, right? Whatever properties we defined inside our DbContext class. Not only it hold a reference to student or student or standard entities, but also keep track, right? What happening with those entities, and this concept is called change tracking, right? What changes is happening to the entity or entities, right? All these things are going to be tracked by the DbContext class or DbContext object, and this concept is called change tracking. So if someone asks you what do you mean by change tracking in entity framework code, then you need to tell these things, right? What you need to tell? You need to tell entity framework code uses the concept called change tracking to determine what operations like insert, update, or delete, what operations should be executed when the step changes method is called, right? So change tracking means it will determine what SQL statement we need to generate, whether we need to generate insert, update, or delete SQL statement whenever the step changes method is called. To determine what operation to be used, right? It will use something called entity states. Each entity tracked by the DbContext class has a state, and that state going to indicate what operations to be perform during the step changes method call. So whether we need to generate insert statement, if whether we need to generate the update statement, or we need to generate the delete statement, that is going to be decided based on the entity state. If the entity state is in added state, insert statement is going to be generated. If the entity state is in modified state, then update statement is going to be generated. If the entity state is in deleted state, then delete SQL statement is going to be generated. If the entity state is unchanged state, nothing is going to be generated by the context object. This concept is called the change tracking. Now let us try to understand the life cycle. Life cycle means what? Now what are the different Already we have discussed, but again, let us try to understand, right? Let me make this one, right? So first of all, you can see this is my entity. This entity can have multiple states. One is detached, added, modified, deleted, and unchanged. We have already discussed. So entity can have five states: detached, added, modified, deleted, and unchanged. But the point that you need to remember, this DbContext object is going to track the entity if it is if the entity has these four states. If the entity having this detached state, then it is not going to be kept track by the DbContext object. And again, if the entity is in added state, if we call the step changes method, then it is going to generate and execute insert statement on the database. If the entity is in a modified state, and if we call the step changes method, it is going to generate the update SQL statement. If the entity is in deleted state, if we call the step changes method, then it is going to generate the delete SQL statement. If the entity is in unchanged state, if we call the step changes method, then nothing will happen. But once the entity is detached, that means it is not being tracked. So if you call the section, there is no relation between the entity having detached state and the DbContext object. And one more thing, guys, you have to remember, right? In order to make the entity state as added, deleted, unchanged, right? All these things, we need to use some method, right? Either we need to use the add method, right? We need to use the remove method, right? Or we need to fetch the data from the database, right? So if you want to make the method entity state as unchanged, right? For all these things, additionally, we have to call some method. But this entity state, right? This modified state, it is going to be managed automatically. To make the entity state as modified, you do not need to do anything special. As soon as you modify some of the properties value, automatically the entity state is going to be modified. But if you want to mark the entity state as a deleted, you need to call the delete method. Or sorry, delete, you have to call the remove method. To mark the entity state as added state, you need to call the add method. And once you find one record using the context object from the database, automatically that is going to be unchanged. Once you have the entity in added, if you right, once you have the entity either in added state or modified state, right? Once you call the step changes method, then once the step changes operation is completed, this added state will be moved to unchanged state. This modified state will be moved to unchanged state, right? But once the entity state is in deleted state, and once you call the step changes method, then this deleted will be moved to detached state. Clear, guys?
Hello,
Yes,
sir.
sir.
Hello, I have one question. Am I audible?
Yes. Yes,
Uh,
yes, yes.
when the reference object has been deleted from the memory,
The reference object means that context object.
not context object. Suppose when we are doing some fetch options from the database, it is creating. Uh, for example, can you go to the code?
See, so in this case, see,
Hmm.
this is my context object,
Yes.
right?
Hmm.
So this context object is going to be deleted as soon as this method execution completed,
Okay.
right? So once this context object is deleted means this reference are also going to be deleted.
Okay. Okay.
So everything is depend on the context object only. So when you create the context object, this is the syntax of what we are using in latest, right? If
Hmm.
you do not understand this syntax, right, then you can go with this. This is the latest C# syntax. So what you can do something like this, right? So within this context object only, you can write all the statements, right? So you can copy. So you can also use this statement. Now tell me when the context object is going to be deleted. Now, once the
When it is.
user, right, if you are using using
Yes.
statement, once the using statement completed here the
Hmm.
context object is going to be garbage collected, right?
Okay. So we should not create context object as a singleton, is it?
Singleton in the sense, how you can
Uh,
make this as singleton? Because you do not know, right? So singleton means one context object for everything,
mm,
right? So if
mm,
you are creating one context object here,
mm,
another right, in this case this is a main method, right?
mm,
Main method means one access, right? Every time the
mm,
method execution is going to start from here. But if you are
mm,
developing one controller,
mm,
right, so in
mm,
that case the right, you are accessing right, many action methods same time. You can
mm,
access action method 1, you can access action method 2, you can access action method 3, right? So
mm,
in that
mm,
case, how it is going
mm,
to maintain all these things? Suppose if you are using singleton object, right, and using
mm,
that object, if you are
mm,
accessing the student property value, right,
mm.
and doing some operation, but you have not call modifying that entity, and but you are not doing the save changes method. Another of right, another action method started, and he fetched the data from the database. Do you are you going to get the updated data?
No.
Right. So singleton means what? If you want to share some global data whose value is not going to be right changed. So in this case, every time we want to get the data, the different value we need to fetch, na?
So in this case, it means that every time when we create a context object, database connections will be happened, right? Because
So,
connection
so
strings, all the things are.
not a connection. See, once you create the context object, don't think that the connection string is open, right? So that basically depends whenever you are communicating with the data. So if I'm creating this context object and if
Mm.
I'm not doing this kind of operations, then nothing is going to be happen, right? It does,
Oh,
and it
okay,
makes sense. If you are not accessing any data from the database, why he is going to open the database connection?
okay, okay. Yeah,
Right,
got it.
and this
Mm,
is and this is the reason why yesterday I
mm,
have told you, you can
mm,
check this thing, right? If you go to this on model configuring method,
mm,
instead of this information you can
mm,
put a debug here, right? Instead of information you can put debug and you can start running the application. Then you will see when the context object is created, right, how it is being created, when the connection string, right, is established, how the statements are generated, executed, when the connection is going to be deleted, right? All these things are going to be taken care by context object. And as right, it is a tested solution, right? Don't think that it is going to impact the performance of your application. What is the best time when to create the connection, right object, when to establish the connection, when to write close the connection, everything is going to be managed by him, and that is
okay.
optimized, right? So if you are using any kind of a pattern, design pattern, or if you are
Mm,
using this ORM approach, ORM tools like Entity Framework code, right? So these
mm,
are a tested solution. They are performance optimized, right? And what is the best way to create the connection object? When to create the connection object, right? What is the best
mm,
way to execute your queries, right? All these things are going to be proven tested, right? So you do not need to be worried about them. They are tested, they are
okay.
optimized, and they will definitely going to give you the best performance. They are going to use the best approach to execute your database storage.
Yeah, okay. Thank you.
Any more question, guys? Okay. So let us try to understand the different entity state, how you can make the entity in different state. Let me give you one by one. So let's start with the added entity state, right? So as we already discussed, let me open the database as well. We are using entity framework or DP1. Selected for students. So currently you can see the last record is student ID 6, right? So let me do one thing. So I have deleted all the records from the student table. So it will generate a fresh data, right? So you can see I have created this context, right? I have created this entity. At this point, the entity is not being tracked, right? And then I'm creating an instance of the context object, right? And then what I'm doing here, I'm adding that entity to the context object. So as we already discussed, you have three options. You can use this option, or you can directly add the entity using the context class add method. There is no difference in the performance. There is no difference in the entity state. There is no difference in generating the SQL statements, right? And then I'm showing what is the state before the step changes and what is the state after the step changes. So in this case, if you look at this code, then you will understand here the entity state is going to be added state, and here the entity state is going to be moved from added to on-chain state. That is what we have discussed, right? So let me run the application. And if you want to see what exactly, right, when what are happening in each and every statement, you can change this log level to work. So this statement, whatever we have written here, it is going to show you what exactly happening in each and every state whenever we are working with the entity framework or DbContext object, right? So with these changes, now run the application and see what happens, right? So you can see a shadow property, right? Student ID is created, right? Entity framework 7.0 initialized the DbContext for instance. So this is student dot right property is created means this is nothing but this one, right? So then you can see entity framework core, right? Initialized the entity framework core DbContext, and what SQL server provider it uses, right? You can say entity from a core SQL server. So basically what it means it is initializing the entity from a core DB context instance by using, right, by using this package. Microsoft Entity Framework or SQL Server. And this Entity Framework DB context is nothing but your DB context object. So DB context object initialized means the instance is created using this database provider. And that what it is saying. So Entity Framework Core 701 initialized Entity Framework Core DB context 1. Why it is saying Entity Framework Core 7.1? Because we are using this version of Entity Framework Core, and it is initializing this entity from a code DB context of, right, or you can say DB context object using this provider, right? So if you go through this line by line, then you will understand what exactly happening in each and every student, right? So then somewhere you can say then what we are seeing here, Microsoft Entity Framework to change the tracking. So change the tracking will come into the picture, right? Whenever we are adding this new entity into the context object, right? And that is what here it is saying, right? Context object, right? Entity framework or DB context, tracking. Which entity is this one? What is the type of this new entity? This type is going to be student entity. That is what saying student entity. Consider using a right enable sensitive data log to see key values, right? If you want to say what are the key values, right? Primary key, what is the value, right? Then you need to use this. That is not required, right? Before step changes, what is the entity state? So this statement means before the step changes, what is the entity state? But guys, remember, we do have, right? In this case, the context object is created. The context object is tracking this entity, right? We are having this new entity state, right? But do you see till now, are you seeing that the connection is established to the database? Did the connection is right opened with the database or established with the database till now? No. So connection is going to be established when you call the step changes method. That is true if you are having any entities within the context object which are having either added, modified, or a deleted state. If there is no entity with the added, modified, deleted state, even though if you call the shift changes method, right, nothing is going to be happen, right? You can see here you can see shift changes method starting, right? Shift changes method is called, right? Step changes method detecting changes. Detecting changes means it will check whether any what are the entities, what are the states. Detect changes method is completed, right? Once the detect changes method is completed, then it will check is there any entities, is there any entities having the entity state added, modified, or deleted. If yes, then it is going to create the database connection. So once it is going to create the database connection, then it will create the database connection. How much time it will take to create the connection? 56 milliseconds, right? So once the connection is created, then what it will do? So in this case, it is going to create the database connection, means what is the database server, what is the what is the database, right? What is the connection string? All these things it is going to take and create the connection. Once the connection is created, it will open the connection to the database, right? Which database we are connecting? We are connecting with the entity framework or DB1 database. And on which server? The server is this one, right? If you go and check, this is my EF code DB1, and if you check the right connection server, then this is my server name, whatever, that is what it is showing here, right? Then open connection to the database, right? The connection is open to the database. Then creating the DP command for execute reader, right? So in this case, it is going to create the database command for executing the SQL statements, right? And then initialize the DP command, right? Then executing the command, right? So once everything is set, then what it is going to do? It is going to execute the database command. And what database command it is going to execute? Insert SQL statement, and that what it is you can see here, right? So once this is completed, then the foreign key property student to ID was detected as changed, right? So in this case, you can see the student ID, it is going to be a foreign key. So these changes consider using this. So currently we are working with only one database table, so you can ignore this. So once this operation is closed, right? So for executing this, it is create an instance of execute reader, right? So first of all, it is going to close that instance. So closing that reader object, right? Right. So then what is going to do once the reader object is closed, then what it will do, it will going to close the database connection. Once the step changes method execution is completed, so at this point of time, it will open the connection, execute the command. Once the command execution is completed, it will close the database connection. So because database connection is very, very important, very, very sensitive. So you should create open the connection as late as possible, and you should close the database connection as early as possible. So in this case, he is also following the same approach, right? So once the connection is closed, then you can see this statement is displaying closed connection to the database, right? Then what it is saying, an entity of type student is tracked by entity core DbContext change the state from added to unchanged, right? Once this statement is executed, right, then it will come back to our right, then it will come back and it will modify this entity state student, right, from added to modified. And then what statement we have written, that is going to be displayed, right? Then you can see step changes completed with one entity returned to the database. Yes, that is fine, because we have added one entity to the database. Then after step changes method, entity state is right unchanged. And then what I'm saying, we're displaying, we are displaying this is saved, right? Whatever the statement we have written, that is what it is displaying, right? And after this, then what it is going to do, as you can see, the use of this var extension method is completed. So before, right, before returning, right, once, before this try block, before coming to this statement, right, this try block execution is going to be completed. So at this moment, so what exactly he is going to do, he is going to dispose this context object, right? So this object is disposed. So this context object is disposed, and that what it is showing here, disposing the connection to the database, and then dispose the connection on the server, right? So this is how the things are happening, right, behind the scene. So that is what you need to understand. What exactly happening in each statement. That is what if you want to track, then you need to use this debug log label. Clear, guys?
Yeah.
Yeah. So now without using this log level debug, right? So can you identify what exactly happening in each and every statement
No.
without using this debugging? If someone asks you what exactly happening at this statement, can you tell?
No.
No. So let me ask you on this. So once we create this entity, what will be the entity state at this point? If I write the statement here, then what should be the entity state? Not here. If I, because context object is not created. So in this statement, right, if I write that particular statement, right, what will be the entity state?
Not changed. There is
Sorry?
no change. Not changed. But
How,
unchanged.
how not changed? How unchanged? Once you create this entity, do you think that this entity is going to be tracked by the context object?
No.
So if the entity is not being tracked by the context object, then what will be the entity state?
Detached.
Detached, right? So that is what I'm trying to explain again and again.
Right.
See, in this case, if I'm creating 10 entities, so do you think that all the 10 entities are going to be tracked by the context object? No, it is not true. So in your application, you are creating 100,000 entities. That doesn't mean everything is going to be tracked by the context object. So by default, they are going to be in detached state. Means these entities are not being tracked by the context object. Once you call this add method, then what will happen? The entity is going to be tracked by the context object, right? And in this case, what will be the entity state? Guys,
Added.
be participant. What will be the entity
Added.
state?
Added.
Added.
Added means what? This entity is being tracked by the context object. But is this entity exist in the database?
No.
No.
No. That is what you need to understand, right? So in this case, it is going to display the entity state as added, and this entity is going to be tracked by the context object, but not available on the database. Now, next, what we are doing, we are calling the step changes method. So whenever we call the step changes method, what are the things going to happen behind the scene? First of all, it will establish the database connection to the database. First thing is creating the connection to the database. Once the database once it establishes a connection to the database, then it will generate the SQL statements, right, based on the entity state. As the entity state is in added, so it is going to generate insert SQL statement, then it will execute those SQL statement into the database, then it will modify, right, then it will, so once the SQL statement is established, then it will close the connection, right, because the work is done, then it will close the connection, then it will modify the entity state from added to unchanged state, and that is the right, that are the things are going to be done by the step changes method. And when we complete this try block, then automatically this context object is going to be disposed. So that is what happening in this case. Any question, guys? Any particular statement you are not understanding in this example?
Sir, there I have seen two insert statement in the
No, no,
execute.
no. There are not two insert statement. So one is creating the insert statement, another one is executing the insert statement on the database.
Okay, fine.
Right. So first of all, he needs to create, then only he is going to execute the database on the database. This is the reason why you can see one is this one, right? You can see here it is using the SQL Server syntax, right? And then it is this statement is going to be executed on the database. So this is the reason why you can see two insert statements. Clear, guys? Why? Oh, see, why I'm saying this thing, because this is important, right? If you are learning entity framework core, you need to understand what exactly happening behind the scene, right? Now, let us try to understand the unchanged state, right? Let us try to explain, or let us try to understand the unchanged state. So we have understand the added state. Now let us try to understand the unchanged state. So in this case, right? In this case, if I'm fetching this entity from the database, right? So in this case, if I'm fetching this entity from the database, then what will happen? The context object is going to create the database connection string. The context object is going to execute the select SQL statement. The context object is going to fetch the data from the database. It is going to fill the student entity, right? And these things are going to be happen here, right? So we are having only one entity, right? So This is 1, so I'm making this as 1, right? So in this case, these are the things going to be happen behind the scene. And then what I'm checking, if student is not null, then what is the state? And if in this case, if I'm going to call the step changes method, so do you think anything is going to happen? First of all, tell me, let me know. So whenever you fetch any data from the database, they are going to be in which state? Guys, if you are fetching some data from the database, then those entity state will be in which state?
Unchanged.
Unchanged.
Unchanged, right? So in this case, the data is going to be in unchanged state, right? And unchanged means what? Can anybody tell me what do you mean by unchanged? The data, if an entity is going to be unchanged state, means what?
Sig-
Now it is
sig-
tracked by the context object, right? It is tracked by the context object, right? And the second point is what? Now the data exists in the database or not?
Yeah. Yes.
Yes.
So that is what you need to remember. If one entity is unchanged state, means what? Like it is being tracked by the context object and the data is existing in the database. So in this case, the student entity with ID 1, if you look, one entity in the database exists. So in this case, this student entity is going to be in unchanged state and it is also going to be tracked by the context object and it is also exist in the database. So in this case, it is going to display what it is going to display. It will show the state as unchanged. And if one entity is unchanged state, if I'm calling the step changes method, do you think that it is going to open the database connection? It is going to do any kind of a database operation on the database?
No.
No. So in this case, nothing is going to happen. And even though if you call the step changes method, so definitely if nothing is happening, then again if you are printing the state, definitely it is also going to print the state as unchanged, right? So unchanged state means the data, whatever the data. So in this case, whatever the data exists in the database, the same data is also available with the context object. That is what means the unchanged state, right? Let me. Hmm. Right, first of all you can see it is executing some SQL query. What exactly happened in this case? Let me run the one more time. Hmm. Right, so you can see detect step changes completed, step changes entity state unchanged, right? And in that case nothing is going to be happening, right? So you can see only one select statement is generated and executed. That's it. Right, so select statement is generated, select statement is executed, paste the data, and then you can see where is our state. So step changes entity state change, right? Entity state is unchanged, and then it is going to dispose the object, right? So that is what exactly happening. Now to see whether any statement is generated or not, right? So you just click this information and see what are the entities, what are the SQL statement is executed on the database if you want to see. And see, you can see only one select statement is executed, that's fine. And this is the thing, right? Before step changes, one system statement we have written to print the state, and after step changes, we have got one statement we have written. And in between this after and before, if you look, we are having this here, right? We are having this step changes method, but that step changes method doesn't generate any kind of a SQL statement or not performing any kind of a operation. And this makes sense because the entity state is unchanged, and unchanged means what? Nothing is going to be happen in the database. So this is the reason why it is not doing anything special. Clear, guys?
Yeah. Yes.
Right. So what I'm going to discuss next is attaching an existing entity to the context object, right? So let us understand what it means, right? Let us understand what it means, right? So if you see the database, right? So if you look at the database, currently we are having this entity, ID1, Pranaya Rout, this is the date of birth, height, weight, and standard ID. And if I'm creating one existing entity object directly like this, Can we attach this entity, right, into the database? Can we attach this entity to the database with using any kind of method? Yes, that is possible. How? Now, if you are having one existing entity data, and if you want to, let me ask you first. So once I create this entity, do you think that this entity is going to be tracked by the context object?
No.
No.
No. So by default, this entity is going to be in which state?
Detached.
Right? So entity state before attach. Entity state, right, before attach. So in this case, the entity state should be going to be in which state? It should be in detached, sorry, which state? Detached state, right? So you have to see this TSCHET, detached state, right? And if you are having one existing entity, and if you want to attach that existing entity to the context object, right, then what method you need to use? You need to use the attach method. And again, like the add method, this attach method you can directly call, right? You can call on the DbSet property, or you can also directly call on the context object, right? So once you call this attach method, then what it will do is, right? So what it will do is it will attach this entity with the context object, and hence the context object now tracking this entity. Understand, guys? So once you attach this entity, right, to this context object, the context object now tracking this entity. So once it will track the entity, then it will check what is this entity state. The entity states is going to be decided based on this property. Whether these properties are already available in the database, yes, these properties with the same value is already available in the database. So it will mark the entity state as unchanged. Clear? So
Yeah.
in this case, it will going to display unchanged. Understand or not? Why it is going to display unchanged?
So object is the same, data is same.
Data is same, obviously. Based on the data only, the state is going to be decided. So this entity, right, this data exists in the database, and the same thing, right, whatever the property value, the same value is available in the database. Then what is the entity? What will be the entity state? Definitely, it is going to be unchanged only. So this is the reason why it will mark this entity state as unchanged. And even if you call this set changes method, then nothing is going to be happen. Let me show you these things. Right? So entity state before attach, definitely it is, if you are not attaching to the context object, it is detached. Before step changes, unchanged. After step changes, unchanged. Why unchanged? Because this data is exist in the database, right? These entities exist in the database, and whatever the value we provided, the same value is also exist in the database. This is the reason why. Another way, if you remember, I have told you that context object having the entry method, right? Using which, right, we can also set the context. We can also set the entity state. So you can also here you can make the entity state as attached, and here also you can use this statement. So if we write explicitly you want to set the state, then in that case you can use this unchanged. Right, so entry method, to this entry method, whatever the object you want to attach, or whatever the entity you want to attach, that entity you need to pass, then you need to set the state of the entity by using this state property, and by using this enum. So by using this enum, you will get access to the all the entity state named constant, and you can set. So in this case also, it is going to do the same thing, right? So you can see it is also going to do the same thing. Clear, guys? So you have two options. You can make use of attach, or you can additionally or explicitly, you can tell to the context object that please, a context object, this is one of my existing entity, and please consider the state of this entity as unchanged. Clear, guys?
Yeah, Pranay, one question I have. For example,
Yes.
in the student table, let us suppose I've given some constraint like not null constraint or any
particular constraint. While assigning data, is it going to throw in an exception, or it is going to restrict me in any way when I put
See,
some
first of all, tell me. So in this case, you are creating the student entity.
Yeah, yeah.
So based on this properties only, you can set the data, right? So there
Okay.
is no link, right? Whatever the null constant, whatever you apply. So here, based on the property only, you can set the value. So if it is a string type value, then you can set null value. Whether it is accepting null value or not in the database, that is a different story altogether. But if you are creating a nullable type value column, property means it can accept null value, right? And
Okay.
for that reason, whatever, right, whether it is a valid value or not, for that we are having something called model validation, right?
Yeah.
We have already discussed model validation. So,
Right.
and that is what I'm saying. Before doing the database operation, it is first important to validate the data. And that is the job of a model validation. And that step will come before this data access,
Yes.
right? So you need to validate the data first. And once you are valid data, then you can go further and you can right, add or update or delete those data into the database. Clear? Right?
Yes.
Suppose you want, I don't want to accept null value, then why you are going to create the column as nullable type? So if you are not expecting any null value, then you should not make this as a nullable type column. You can make it as a not null column, right? But if you are creating, right, something like this, string property means it can accept a null value, no issue. Right, and if you want to make sure, right, whether I should not accept any null value or I should not do any kind of any of this thing, then you can validate the data here, na. Suppose you need to make sure that first name should be greater than this thing, then only I need to validate the data, right? Then you can write the if condition and you need to check whether the first name is not null, right? It should not be null or empty. It should having the length greater than 5 characters. That manual statement you can also write here. Clear?
Yeah, yeah.
So in this case, right, the thing is that the existing entity we are adding. Now what my intention? I modify this value 1 to 2. So I modify this value 1 to 2. So now tell me, is this entity exist in the database?
No.
No. If this entity is not exist in the database, right? Then if I call this attach method, then what will happen? So instead of saying existing entity, let me give this as a new entity. So meaning is going to be, right, important. So in this case, if this entity is not exist in the database, so whenever we call, so definitely at this point the entity state is going to be detached, no issue. So in this case, what will happen? So first of all, it will check, is this entity exist in the database? No. If
So,
it is not exist in the database, then what is the meaning of a added state? Added state means the entity is going to be tracked by the context object, but that entity is not exist in the database. The same condition coming here or not, this entity is going to be tracked by the context object, but this entity is not exist in the database. Means which state, guys?
added.
Detached.
How detached? Detached means entity is not being tracked by the context object. And if you are attaching this entity to the context object using the attach method, means what? This entity is going to be now tracked by the context object. And whenever the context object tracking an entity means that entity state cannot be detached. That is the first point that you need to remember. Understand?
Yes.
So in this case, this entity is tracked by the context object, and this entity, right, is not exist in the database. Then this is nothing but a condition of a added state. Means added state means what? The entity is tracked by the context object, but not exist in the database. So in this case, as the entity state as added, right? And so in this case, definitely it is going to show the state as added. So in this case, it is going to display the entity state as added. So whenever we call the step changes method, does entity framework or going to do anything else?
Yeah, it will add the object
So
into the database.
Exactly. It will add the object into the database by executing which kind of statement? Insert, update, or delete?
Insert.
Insert. Once the object, right, once the entity is inserted into the database, then what will be the entity state? Once the entity is inserted into the database, now the data in the database and the data with this entity state, right, is going to be same or different?
Same.
This will be unchanged.
Sorry?
It.
Unchanged.
So it will be something called unchanged. Right? Let me run the application and show you these things. It is showing like this. Oh, we need to give some different value. Test. So I'm providing this as a test and state because in this case the student ID is not required. Okay, let me run the applications. Right. So in this case, you can see before the entity is being added, it is in detached state. Before step changes, it is added state. And in the step changes method, it is generating this insert statement. After the step changes method, the entity state is changed to unchanged. Clear, guys? See, this is the important, this is the life cycle. Once you understand this, right, entity states, then you will not find any difficulty to understand the later concept. Any question related to this particular example? Right? Now, if you want to mark this entity as added state, then what you need to do explicitly if you want to mark, then you just need to do this thing. That's it. Right? So now we have added a new entity into the existing. Now, detached state. Detached state means what? The entity is not being tracked by the context object. Right? So now if you look at this example, right? So we are fetching one student ID from the database. So at this point, right, entity state is going to be, let's tell me. So I'm not going to explain what will be the entity state. Once I fetch the data from the database, in this statement, what will be the entity state?
Unchanged.
Unchanged, right? And if I mark this entity state as a detached, right, entity state, and if I'm explicitly marking this entity state as a detached, then what will be the entity state here? Detached, right? After making any changes, right? After making these changes, what will be the entity state?
Modified.
How
Added.
modified? How added? So
Detached
if
only
you just
because.
utilize your brain. Once the entity in a detached state, do you think that a context object is tracking that entity?
No.
No. If the context is not tracking an entity, if not the context object is not tracking that entity, then how it is going to change the entity state from detached to added, detached to modified, or detached to deleted?
Right. Right.
Is
Forcefully
it
we need to
possible?
no.
No.
Not
So
possible.
in this, not possible because once the entity in a detached state means no info, nothing is happening, no tracking information. So, so in this case, even though you are modifying the entity state, the state is going to be detached only. And on detached state, if you are calling step changes method, then nothing is going to be happen. So in this case also, no SQL statement is going to be generated. It will show you the state as a detached. So first time, it is going to show you the state as unchanged. And once you mark the entity as detached, then nothing is going to be happen. The entity is not being tracked. So if you are modifying any changes, if you are calling the review method, if you are doing anything, right, nothing is going to be affect the context object. And if context object not tracking anything, right, then you can see. So first of all, it will fetch the data before the right detached. You can see the state is unchanged. And this statement state is nothing but this one unchanged. And once you make the entity state as attached, right? So you can see entity state after detached is detached. entity state after step changes is also detached, right? So in this case, it is also not going to do anything special. So the point that you need to remember is once one entity moved to detached state, whatever you do, if you modify the properties, if you delete the entity from the context object, even if you call the step changes method, nothing is going to happen with that particular entity. Clear, guys?
Yeah, right.
Right? So this is another important point that you need to remember, right? Next, we are going to understand the modified entity state example. And this is very simple, right? We have already discussed, right? I'm not going to take more time. So first of all, you need to fetch the entity. And before modifying, right, once you fetch the entity in this state, okay, guys, tell me, in this case, what will be the entity state? What will
Unchanged.
be the entity?
And
Added or
unchanged.
unchanged?
Unchanged.
Added or unchanged?
Unchanged. Unchanged.
Yes, unchanged. CSANCED. So once you modify the property, so what will be the entity state?
Modified.
Modified.
Modified. Once you call the step changes method, what will be the entity state?
Unchanged.
Unchanged. Because once you call the step changes method, whatever modification you have done, those are going to be updated in the database. Means what? Now, whatever data you are having with this entity, the same data is available in the database. So the state is going to be unchanged. And why modified? Because the data what we are having with the student entity with the context object, right? Having the different data in the database. Because here the first name is first name changed, right? But in the database, it is something else. So this is the reason why the state is going to be modified, right? Let me run the application. Right? You can see first it is generating the select statement to fetch the data, and then it is using the update statement to update the data. So before the modification, the state is unchanged. After modification, the state is changed to modified, and after the step changes, again the state is back to unchanged. So this is how the modified or the strategy worked in Entity Framework code. Clear, guys?
Yes,
Yeah.
clear.
Okay. Next one is deleted, and this is the last state that what we need to understand. We have already discussed added, we have discussed modified, we have discussed detached, we have discussed all these tests. Now it is the last one, that is the deleted state, right? So here I have fetched the entity from the database,
Right.
right?
For
Sorry.
example, when we are adding this new records, if it is
Mhm.
student ID is identity column, in that case, if you are adding any
See,
record
in
with
that case, see, just tell me if you are adding an entity, since that ID is going to be auto-generated or not, that what first you need to decide, right? If you are making that column as identity column, then that ID column is going to be simply ignored,
okay, even if you are
right?
supplying also, it will be ignored.
It will be ignored. We will discuss that things, right?
Okay.
Once you discuss, right, data annotation attribute, how you will make the identity column, right? How you want to ignore the identity column, on which type of a column you can make identity, right? All these things we are going to discuss day by day,
Okay.
right?
Got.
Everything is the pipeline. See,
Okay.
I'm explaining entity framework code means I'm going to explain everything in depth, right? I'm not going to simply give you the database crowd operation one day and complete. It is not kind of things like this. I'm going to explain everything behind the scene, what is happening, everything you will able to learn, right? So
Okay.
this is the reason why I'm saying that entity framework will take at least 2 weeks, right? I can complete entity framework in one day or 2 days, but I'm taking 2 weeks means definitely I'm going to deliver many things, and definitely you are going to enjoy the classes. You will learn a lot more things, right? Even I don't know whether you know or not, but these things are also available in entity framework. Whether you know or don't know, I don't know, right? But you should know all these things, right? So you can say I'm creating the context object, I'm fetching the data from the database. So before this remove method, right? What will be the entity state? Can anybody tell me?
Unchanged.
Unchanged.
Unchanged, right? So once I call the remove method, then it will mark the entity state as
Deleted.
what? Deleted. So deleted means what? Can anybody tell me? Deleted means what? Deleted means
Marked for
the
deletion.
context object tracking that entity marked for deletion exist in the database but not deleted. Clear, guys?
Yes, right.
Right. So in this case, what will happen? In this case, this entity student is exist in the database. And this is the reason why it is saying the entity state as unchanged, because this data, whatever available in the database and whatever data with this context object, right, is going to be same. This is the reason why unchanged. And once you remove this, means it will mark the entity as deleted, right? It will mark the entity as deleted in the context object, right? So in this is the reason why it is going to print the state as a deleted, right? But this entity deleted means what? The entity is marked as a deleted but not yet deleted from the database. So once you call the step changes method, then what will happen? It is going to generate the delete SQL statement, going to be execute those delete SQL statement in the SQL Server database, right? As we are using SQL Server, right? And then once the data is deleted, then it will mark the entity state as what?
Unchecked.
What?
Detach.
Detached.
Unchecked.
Detached or unchanged?
Detach.
Exactly. It will mark the entity state as detached. Why? Because this data, what we are having with the context object, is no more exist in the database. Right? Once you delete the data from the database, the entity framework cannot track that data. This is the reason why it is going to set the state as detached. Right? So now let me run the application and show you the output. See, first one SQL statement is generated to fetch the data, and before deleting the entity state is unchanged. Once you call the remove method, the entity state is marked as deleted. Then it is executing the delete SQL statement to delete the data from the database. And once the data is deleted, then the entity state is marked as detached. Clear, guys?
Yeah, right.
Right? So what step changes method does? So the step changes method does these things, right? So whenever the entity state is unchanged, nothing will happen. If the entity state is added state, it will generate the insert SQL statement, right? If the entity state is modified, it will generate modified SQL statement, right? And if the entity state is delete, then it is going to generate the delete SQL statement. Apart from this, it is also going to open the database connection, close the database connection, right? Create the execute reader or data, right? The reader object. Using that reader object, it is going to, right, execute those statements. These are the things that what is going to be done by the step changes method in entity framework code. Clear, guys?
Yeah, right.
Right. So next what we are going to discuss is LINQ to entities, right? So basically, if you are working with the right entity framework code, you should be aware about LINQ. How you can effectively utilize the entity framework code, that basically define how strong you are into LINQ. If you are strong in LINQ, right, then you will understand these things very clearly, right? So you will understand this concept very clearly. So let us try to understand what are exactly LINQ, how you can use LINQ to query. See, for performing the insert, update, and delete operation, this LINQ queries are not required. Give me 1 minute, Bala. So if you are performing insert, update, and delete operations, right, LINQ is not required. But guys, remember, if you are creating one database, so how many times you are going to use the insert, update, and delete statement, and how many times you are going to use the select statement? Insert, update, delete one time. So if you are having some data, if you want to insert some data, definitely insert statement, write DML statement you are going to use. But most of the time, if you want to show the data in the data, right, in the UI, then you need to use the select statement. And whenever you are going to use the select statement, you have many options. Many options in the sense you want to paste the data order by name, order by right gender, You want to fetch the first 10 records, right? You want to fetch the first 10 highest salary, right? You want to fetch the data, right? By grouping, right? Based on the department wise, I want to show the data, right? Then you need to fetch the data by, right, joining multiple tables, right? Many things you need to do, right? Right, as per your business requirement. And in all the scenario, you need to use the select SQL statement. And whenever I'm saying LINQ to entities means it is related to our select SQL statement. Means if you are having data in the database, how effectively you can utilize your entity framework query using LINQ to fetch the data. That is what most important things, right? So entity framework means entity framework is 50%, LINQ is 50%. If you understand LINQ as well as the entity framework, then you can say I'm good at entity framework. I can develop the application using entity framework. So let us try to understand what exactly this LINQ to entities. Let me close this one. Okay. So LINQ to entity. So LINQ means a language integrated query. It is a powerful feature that is allow the .NET developers to write queries directly using the C#, right? So you do not need to use a select star from all these things, right? Any SQL statement. Using C# statement also you can write the queries, right? When working with the entity framework code, we can use LINQ to entity query, right? Our entities in a way that like we are working with the in-memory object, right? If you are not using the entity framework code, right? If you are not using entity framework, still you can, you are having a collection, and on that collection you want to paste the data, you can also use LINQ to write LINQ, and that is nothing but you can say I'm working with the in-memory object. In the same approach only, we are going to use, right? The LINQ to entity. So LINQ provide a common query syntax. So common query syntax means what? So common query syntax means irrespective of the data source, the query is going to be same. Whether you are working with a XML file, whether you are working with a collection, right, like a list of employees, or whether you are working with the database, right, the query is going to be common. Right, you do not need to learn a specific syntax for specific database. Right, if your database is MySQL, if your database is SQL Server, whether your database is Oracle, right, your right, the LINQ statement, whatever you are going to write using C# or VB.NET, it is going to be same. Right, let us try to understand these things practically. Right, so what I'm going to do, I'm going to modify the entities. So this is my student entity, right? This is my student entity. Few properties I have created here. This is my standard entity. So this is my standard entity, right? So let me modify these things. This is my context object. Okay, already we have this thing now. So let me do one more thing. So I am going to change. Let me truncate this table, right? Let me truncate and let me add this statement, right? And let me open a new query window, select star from students, select star from standards, right? Now, if you execute this thing, then you will see this thing, right? So, what exactly this? Oh, okay, truncate table, students, truncate table, standards. Let me okay. Let me delete this table directly. Okay. Let me go to my program class. Okay. Okay. Let me build the application to check whether any error or not. Build the solution. Okay. Some error is there. What error is there? This is the error. So let me build the solution. Build successful, right? So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to generate another migration. Okay, guys, tell me how to generate a migration. Open the package manager console. What
Add
command I
mi-
need to write?
add
Add
migration.
migration, right? You need to give a name, right? So what name I'm going to give? EF core DB1 I have given earlier. EF core DB2 I am giving the migration name as EF core DB2, right? And then press the enter button. So build started, build succeeded. And then what you need to do, you need to update the migration, right? So how to update? You need to write update database, update database, right? So once you do these things, right, it will generate and it will do all these things, right? So done. Now if you check, right, you will
Sir, I
see,
have one question at this moment. Sorry. Hello.
yes, yes.
Uh, Add migration. It will create one file, right? What is the purpose of that file? Why can't we create directly a database?
See,
Why can't we
what is the
update?
purpose means? Okay, what is the purpose means? So, what
Mm,
are the changes you have done earlier? Right. So, if you see,
oh,
we are having two migration files. One is EF core DB1, another one
mm,
is EF core DB2. So, this
mm,
is the first migration we have created, and this migration file contains all the information, right? What are executed on the database. And this migration file two means, right? It is the new one. And in this case, you can see nothing is there because whatever migration happening in this first file, the same thing is also happening here, right? So basically in each migration, so whenever we are creating a new migration means we might be updated something, right? Or it might, okay, so we might be deleted something, right, in the earlier one. If there is no changes, why I'm going to create a new migration, right? So
okay,
basically
okay,
migration files means it containing the information what new table I'm going to create in the database, what existing table I'm going to delete it, what indexes you are added, what indexes you are removed, what property you have added in an existing table, what property you have modified in an existing table, right? What modification you want to do comparing with the earlier migration, that information is going to be stored by the migration. Clear?
yeah, yeah. Suppose if we deleted old one, it will be created. The migration file will be contains previous one as well as the new
Yeah,
one as
we
well.
are going to discuss all these things, right? I have not
Okay,
discussed yet what exactly this migration files, snapshot files. I'm going to
okay,
discuss these things again, right?
okay,
But now there is nothing to be worried about. Why? What exactly this migration file? Migration file is going to check what exactly the context object, what changes you have done, what changes, right? You have done comparing with the earlier one, right? Those informations are going to be pulled by this one. Suppose you are only deleting one, right, table, right?
mm,
Deleting one, what I can say, uh, right? You remove one of the deficit properties, then it is not going to generate the whole database again. It is simply going, it is new migration only contain the script which is going to delete that particular table from the database, right? So that is the reason why we are creating different migrations. And later, if you want to, right, come back to this EF code DB1 migration, right, then what you need to do, right, you can see here I'm using this update command, update database, right? So
mm.
instead of update database space, whatever the migration you created, EF core DB1, create EF core DB1 or EF core DB2, that name you need to provide and just click the enter button. And based on that
Okay,
migration file only, it is going to update the database.
okay, okay. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Right? So our database is created and you can see those two tables are going to be there, right? So now once the database is created, let me execute this statement. Once this statement is generated and you can see this is my student table and this is my standard table, right? So using this student and standard table, I'm going to perform different LINQ operations, right? So What is LINQ? We have already discussed. What is projection? Projection. Can anybody tell me what is projection in LINQ? Right? See, whenever we are fetching the data from the database using the LINQ query, do you want the same set of data, or do you want to modify the data? That is what projection. Projection means what you want to project to the output, right? Okay, I will show you this thing practically. So basically what I'm going to discuss is, right, if you are working with LINQ and you can see faster debug LINQ, right? These are many different LINQ methods that what you can use. Let us try to understand. Before moving to LINQ method, let me explain you the use of a find method. Okay, let us directly understand this thing with one example. So this find method is belongs to the DbContext or context object, right? So you can use the DbContext find method or you can use the context object find method, right? So you can see here what I'm doing now, context dot students dot find. So basically in this case, what exactly this find method is going to do is it is going to check, right, the student table, and it is going to figure, right, what is the whether this entity with this ID means what, this is the primary key, is this any entity with this primary key exist? If exist, fetch the data. So if you go and check this student table, so there is a student whose value ID student ID 1 is exist. That means this find method is going to issue a select statement based on the primary key. So find method is basically used to find the data based on the primary key, right? But there is a but there is something interesting about this find method. What is the interesting thing is that, right, so once you fetch the student ID, right, with once you fetch the student with ID 1, then this context object is tracking that student, right, tracking that student whose ID is 1. Second time if you are accessing the same student, then in this time, it is not going to generate the select SQL statement and fetch the data from the database. Already that student is available within the context object. Yes, available. Then it will return that student information from the context object only. So no matter, right, first time whenever you are accessing, then this primary key it will check in this context, right, in this context object, is there any student whose ID is 1 exist? No, it is not exist. Then only it will go to the database, fetch the data, right? But if that student is already exist in the database, which is in the second case, then in that case, it will not execute or generate any SQL statement. It simply return the data from the context object. So in this case, you can see I'm trying to fetch the student ID 1. Here also I'm trying to fetch the student ID or 1. So in this case, you will see only one select statement. But if I'm trying to fetch the student whose ID is 2, right? So in this case, the student with ID2 is not exist in the context object. So again, in this case, it will issue a select SQL statement to get the data, right? So let me run the application, right? So you can see one select statement is execute to fetch the student ID 1. And you can see first name and last name is printed. Second time it is printing the first name and last name without issuing a new select statement. But third time, again, the right name what you want to fetch, right? That name is not exist. That the student ID is not exist in the context of this. So again, it is issuing a new select statement, and that is what it is printing here. Right? If the student is not exist either in the context object or in the database, then what is the default value that is going to be stored? Clear, guys?
Yeah.
So this is the advantages of using find method. So the point that you need to remember is the first level of caching is going to be provided by Entity Framework Core for performance improvement. This is not available, right, with what I can say Entity Framework. This is available with Entity Framework Core. The first level of caching is going to be provided by Entity Framework Core. Right, so it will first check whether the data available in the context object or not. If it is available, from there only it is going to return, same as caching. So how we are implementing caching? Caching means first it will check whether the key is available in our cache or not. If it is available, return the data from the cache. If not available, fetch the data from the database, right? Store the data into the cache and then return the data to the client. That first level of caching, right, is going to be provided by entity framework. Clear, guys?
Yes, yeah.
Right. So next, what I'm going to discuss, faster level, right? So guys, remember, we can write the syntax in two different ways. What are the different ways? We can write the syntax using method, or we can write the syntax using the query approach. So we can use method syntax or query syntax to write the LINQ queries, right? So let me try to explain you faster and faster default method. So whether you use the fast method or faster default methods, right? Whatever predicate you specified, once that predicate matched with the first right element in the collection, that element is going to be returned. So in this case, if I'm using faster default, so what exactly it is going to do? It will check the student's database where the first name is Pranaya, and once the first match is found, that data is going to be returned. And same in the case of a fast, it is also going to check the database based on the predicate you specified. Once the first match is found, that data is going to be written from the database. And in this case, you can see this both are going to return the same data. And in this case, you can see I'm using this faster default method. So this is nothing but your method syntax, right? And you can also achieve the same thing using the query syntax. The way we are writing the right SQL query, in the same way we can also write this, right? From S in context. So this is nothing but you can select a right star from the database where the right condition name, you need to specify the value, right? And then you need to project what you want to return, whether you want to return all the column value or whether you want to return some specific value. In this case, if I'm specifying S means all the student column value, it is going to return, and then we need to call the faster default method. And here the same thing is also here, but here I'm calling the first method. So basically, if you run the application, in this case, right, everything is going to give you the same output, right? So one select statement is a issue, it is displaying first name and last name. Another select statement is issue, it is displaying the same first name and the last name. Another select statement is issue, right? It is displaying the first name and last name. Another select statement is issue, it is displaying the first name and last name. But in this case, as we are not using the find method, so in this case, the caching is not caching will not come into the picture, right? So this is the how this faster default method is going to be work. Now you might have one question, right? Writing the query in two different ways is fine, right? Either you can use, right? Either you can use, or what I can say, faster default, right? Whether you can use the method syntax or query syntax to write the query, that is fine. But if both are doing the same thing, then what is the difference between them? Can anybody tell me what is the difference between these two methods?
Uh, If we use first method, then in the database, if the data is not found, then it throws the exception. And in first or default, it is handled that if the data is not found, then it is not giving any error.
It is not giving any error. Why it is not giving any error? That is what my question.
Actually, it will set the default value.
Exactly. So what is the default value of the data type? That default value is going to be set. So in this case, what type of a data we want to return? We want to return a student object. Student is a reference type. What is the default value of a reference type? Null. So in that case, it is going to store null. And this is not happening in this case. So if the data is not available, it is going to throw the error, right? For example, I'm giving here Pranay 2. I'm making this right to gives to throw some kind of error, right? Let me run the application and see where the exception is throwing, right? So you can see, first of all, it is executing the select statement, and here you can see first name and last name. It is not printing any value because the object is null. Second SQL statement is executed, but then it is throwing the error. Sequence contains no elements, right? What it means? It means the condition what you specify to paste the data with that predicate, there is no element available in the sequence. Sequence in your database or in your collection. Clear, guys? Clear or not?
Yeah, right.
So this is a very simple thing that what you need to understand, right? So parameterized query. So instead of hard coding this data, right? Parameterized query in the sense, here you can see I have hard coded the data. So instead of hard coding this data, you can also use a parameter, right? So for example, here I have created a variable called fast name, and I can use that parameter here also, right? That is also possible using LINQ. So if you are working with LINQ, so if you are having some variable, right, which hold the parameter value, then you can also use that parameter inside your query, right? So you can see we are getting the data. Clear, guys? So you can also use this kind of syntax. You can hard code the value, but in real time, we are not going to hard code. We will get the data from some query parameter or some request body, and from that data, I want to paste the value, and that is what how you can do this. Tool list method, guys, remember, whenever we are executing the query, there are two approaches. One, the query might be going to be executed in deferred, or it is also going to be executed in immediate, right? So what do you mean by deferred query execution, and what do you mean by immediate query execution? Can anybody tell me? What do you mean by deferred query execution, and what do you mean by immediate query execution?
According to the requirement, it will be called. Whenever it is required, it is called.
No, that is fine. As per our requirement, we need to go for either deferred query execution or immediate query execution. That is absolutely fine. But my question, what do you mean by deferred query execution, and what do you mean by immediate query execution, and how we can achieve this?
Deferred means it will use the lazy loading. It will just create the statement. If we use to list, then it will actually
No, lazy
create.
loading and say lazy loading and eager loading are two different concepts. There is no link between your deferred and immediate query execution along with lazy loading and eager loading. Lazy
Deferred
loading
means
and eager loading.
it will just create the insert, delete, or update statement, but it won't access the data from the database. Once we use to list, then it will fetch all the data from the database.
If I'm not using to list, then it will not fetch the data.
No, it will just create the statement.
So in this case, it means if I'm writing this, if I'm executing this statement, this example at this time, then it is not going to display anything. That is
It
what
will
you
display,
meant to tell.
it will display something, but it will
For
not
each
execute
statement,
it.
when we are using for each statement, in that case, here it will be
Exactly.
fetched. Until we don't use the for
Exactly.
each statement, the
Exactly.
data will not be
Exactly.
fetched.
Exactly. So if you are using this statement, in this case, at this statement, the data is not going to be fetched from the database. But whenever you use this variable, right, within a loop or like for each loop, so so at this time, so whenever this statement is executing, so first in this case, it will execute the query, right, whatever this query is, it will fetch the data, then it will access those data one by one. So the point that you need to remember is deferred execution means whenever you use right access the element for the first time, at that time only the query is going to be executed. So here we are accessing for the first time. So within this for each loop, when the loop is going to be executed, it will be executed one by one. So first time you are accessing the first element from this collection. Yes, at that time only the query is going to be executed. So in this case, you can see what is the data type. The data type is DbSet of a student, right? So in this case, instead of this students, if you use this to list, to array, to lookup, some method like this, right? Then in this case, you can see list of a student. So in this case, as soon as you apply this to list method, immediately the query is going to be executed and the data is going to be fetched, right? So let me first, and this concept is called immediate query execution. Immediately the query is going to be executed in the database and the data and the result is being fetched, right? So let me run this application and you can see immediately the query is executed and the data is being fetched. And to make sure, right, whether the query right executed or not, so I have written some dummy statement here to make sure that the query is executed. Some dummy statement, right? That means if this select statement is executed before this dummy statement, then we can make sure that the query is executed. If not, if this select statement is executed after this dummy statement, means the query is not executed. Right? Let me run the application. See, before the dummy statement, the query is executed or not? Yes or no? Guys,
Yeah.
so means what? The query is executed immediately, right? Now, if I remove this statement, then what will happen? In this case, the query is going to be generated but not executed, right? Let me run these things. First a dummy statement, then only the query is going to be executed. Clear, guys? What is the difference between deferred execution and the immediate execution?
Yeah, got it.
Anybody having any question? So lazy loading and eager loading, both are two different things, right? Later, once this statement is completed, later in the sense, tomorrow only I'm going to discuss what exactly the meaning of a lazy loading, eager loading, right? Explicit loading, what is the difference between them, when to use lazy loading, when to use eager loading, does lazy loading give you better performance, does eager loading going to give you better performance, right? All these things we are going to discuss tomorrow. But for now, this is the difference between your immediate execution and deferred execution. So then order by method, right? If you want to sort the data either in ascending or descending order based on column, right? Then you can use order by. So even if you want to sort the data based on multiple columns, then you can also use order by, and then you need to use the then by method, right? Order by, then by is also there. Right? That is what you need to use, right? So I'm not going to discuss those LINQ concept in detail. I'm just going to give you a brief idea how you can use this concept, right? So first of all, you need to create the context object, and I want to access the data in first name in descending order. So here I'm going with the query syntax, right? Select star from students, order by whatever the name in descending order, and then select all the students. And then here, and this is nothing but your query syntax. You have to read in this way. So this statement is nothing but select star from students, order by first name ascending, and then you need to fetch, right, whatever data this star represent. If you want to return all those data to store inside this variable, or you want to fetch a few data, right? If you want to return all the data, then you need to use whatever the parameter or whatever the variable you created. And here, this is the method syntax. You have to use the order by method. And to this order by method, you need to specify the column name or property name based on which you want to sort the data. And here I'm using the toList method, means the data is going to be executed immediately. And in this case, if you want to write, if you want the query to be executed immediately, then you need to use toList method like this. Clear, guys? Right? So let me run the application and see whether the data is going to be sorted in ascending order based on the first name property or not. So first name, you can see the first name is sorted based on the property name. Clear, guys?
Yeah.
Right. So this is how you can sort the data. Anonymous result. So as I mentioned, right, you can project the data. If you want, do you want to project all the properties values, or you want to project some of the properties value, right? So if you can say select a star from object, right? Select a star from students table, and then so right here you have two options. Right. So here you have two options. Select STD, right? So you have two options. So in this case, what will happen? Right? So in this case, what will happen? Now select a star from student, select student, means in this case, all the students properties I'm returning. So instead this STD means all the student properties, right? So this STD, see from STD means in this STD you can consider star, and if you are using the same STD here, means you are returning all the properties value. Instead of all the properties, if you want to return select properties, right? If you look at the student, I want to return first name, last name, height and weight. I don't want to return the student ID. I don't want to return date of birth. I don't want to return the standard ID. I only want to return the string two properties and these two decimal properties. Then how you can do this, right? So for that purpose, you can create a simple class or you can project the data to an anonymous type. For example, if I'm going with a simple class, okay, let me go to the student table, right? I create a copy of this class, right? I provide this class name as my student. And inside this my student class, I'm having these four properties, right? I'm having these four properties. My student. So I want to return these four properties. So what I can do is I can go to my project and I can specify these things. So here you can see this class having the first name property, this class having the last name property, right? This class is having the height property, and this class is having the weight property. So these are the four property I want to project. So that object you need to create here. So here this statement you can consider this is nothing but your object creation with the initialization statement. So what kind of object I created? I create new my student. So whatever the properties this my student class having, that what you can access here. And you want to initialize these properties? Yes, I want to initialize. From where you will get the data? You know, this std variable is there. This std variable contain the student's object, right? From this student's object, right? Whatever the property value you want to fetch, that you can fetch. Wherever you want to store, you can store. This is how. And here you can also, right? Suppose I don't want to use this property. I want to modify. Yes, you can modify, right? Student height. If this is null, right? I want to store, right? 0. So that is also possible, 0.0. So you can specify something like this, y error. Float and the decimal cannot be applied. So what is the data type of the student? Oh, this is decimal and float, right? So what type of variable? What decimal? Right? So you can see. So why I'm getting that error? Because this is not a nullable type property, right? Weight is not a nullable type property. So this is the reason why I'm getting this error. We cannot apply this operand on a nullable type property. So you want set some right default value, or you want to execute some default logic. It is what you can apply here, right? So this is how you can fetch the data, right? So now, right, if you want to display those data, then you just need to write these statements, right? First name dot first name, last name, right, and height, and the weight if you want to access these things. Okay, wait, right? Let me comment these things. And again, you can also do the same thing using the method syntax, right? So using the method syntax, you can also do the same thing, right? So using this method syntax also, you can do the same thing. Right? So here you can see I'm creating an instance of this my new type and initializing all these new type properties from this variable, and this variable having access to all access to the student object. So whatever the properties having within the student class, that properties you can access. And this is nothing using the query syntax, and you can also do the same thing using the method syntax. So in this case, you can see I'm using this select method to project the properties. So here I'm using the lambda expression. I can specify my object type, and once you specify a particular object type, whatever the properties, right, you want to initialize, from where you want to get the value, that what you can specify here. And if you run the application, right, then you will get the data as expected. Right, so this is my select statement is executed, and you can see these are the data. And this is my select statement, and these are my data, right? So this is how you can project the data to a different type. Now This now your student object having these properties, but I don't want to return all these properties. I want to return these properties to the client. So I can create a new type and I can initialize that new type with the required value and I can return this new type to the client. But guys, remember one thing, right? If in this case, can we achieve the same thing without using the student entity? Yes, you can also achieve the same thing using the student. So let me assume that I don't have the student entity in my application. I don't want to create a new type, right? So I don't want to create a new type because this is only one time use. Here only I want to use. So can I achieve the same thing? Yes. Simply remove this thing and it is going to work as expected. So once you remove these things, right, then what it will happen? It will create a anonymous object, right? So this is nothing but your anonymous object. So the using this select method or using the select operator, you can project the data. You can project the data as it is. If you write select std, then it will return all the student column properties. You can project the data, right? Like this way, right? Using right, if you are creating one type, right, what we have discussed earlier, that what you can do, also you can project the data to an anonymous type like this. So this is also going to work as expected, right? So using this select projection, you can project the data to the same type. You can project the data to a named type, different named type. You can also project the data to a anonymous type. So these are the three options that were available, right, with us. Clear, guys, or any question? And here you can see this is showing in this way. You can pick, because if this project property name and this property name is the same, then you can simply ignore this one. No issue, right? So that is what you need to understand. Clear, guys?
Yeah.
Okay. So this is how you can make use of. And guys, remember, whenever we are performing any kind of operations, right, without joining, your database is not completed. So you need to know how to make joining of two tables, three tables, four tables, right? Like this. Let us try to understand, right, how you can perform the joining operation using your LINQ query, right? I'm going to show you the joining operation using two tables. So once you process, right, you just try to learn the LINQ concept, right, by yourself. How you can join two tables, how you can join three tables, four tables. Once you understand two tables, joining with multiple tables is not a big deal, right? See, how you can, let us try to understand how you can join these two tables. So what we have created, student and standard, by using the LINQ to entity scoring, right? So first of all, we need to, for method syntax, you need to use this join extension method. So context dot student. So whenever you are going to perform join, at least two data sources is required. So in this case, this context dot students, it is nothing but my outer data source. You can say this is one of the database table. And whenever we are joining using this join method, then you need to specify the inner data source. Means this is the left hand side table and this is the right hand side table. You can consider in this way. So this is one table. I'm joining with the standard table. But guys, remember, whenever we are going to perform the joining operation, we need a common key, right? And we need a common column. And based on the column, we are going to perform the operation. So in this case, if you look at the standard table, which is my right, primary key table, and this is student, which is my foreign key table, right? Then based on this two table, guys, tell me which is the common key. Sorry,
Standard ID.
Standard ID.
standard ID is the common key because this standard ID exists here and the same standard ID exists here. So if I want to perform joining operation between these two tables, then I need to use the standard ID column. So once you specify the outer data source, inner data source, then you need to specify the common key, right? For the student table, what is the common key? Student dot standard ID. So if you go to the student table, the student table having this standard ID, right? So I will show you how you can directly create the standard ID column here, right? It is also possible to create the standard ID column here. In this example, the standard ID column not available inside the student entity, but if you go to this student database table, standard ID column have. You might be confusing How it is possible? The property name is not I mean, the property name is not showing here, but it is available here. That is possible. How? Once we discuss the primary key and foreign key, you will understand this concept. So, but now the student table having a reference to the standard entity, and this standard entity having a property called standard ID, and that is what I'm accessing here, right? So that property I'm accessing here. So this is my right inner key selector, and what is my outer key selector? That is nothing but your student table. So in the student, this is outer key. This is outer key selector. This is inner key selector, right? So student is the outer data source. So within these changes, right, then you need to specify the outer key column name. So based on these two columns, right, student standard ID of students table and the standard ID of the standard table, it is going to perform the LINQ inner join between the student and the standard table. So once this things is done, then what we need to do? We need to use anonymous object. So first of all, you can access, right? I want to access the standard student table data. So for that purpose, I'm using the student variable. And to access the standard table data, I create one standard variable. This is nothing but an anonymous method, right? So anonymous method means projecting the data. So now I'm creating. So in this case, you can create a new type, right? With this properties to name, standard ID, standard description, student ID, or you can also project the data to an anonymous type. Let me create a new type first to show these things. So I'm creating one class, public class, right? Student standard. I'm giving the class name as a student standard, and inside this class, I'm going to create these properties, right? So I created one property, right? What the name, the type is going to be string. The property name is going to be student name, right? Then I'm going to copy this 4 times, right? So one property is going to be standard ID. It is of type integer, and another property is going to be standard description, and another property is going to be student height. So height is of which type? Height is of type decimal. So let me put this as a decimal. So these are the type I created. So now what I can do is I can also use this type to project the data. So here, if you come, instead of projecting the data to anonymous type, you can also specify this type, right? So once you specify, it might, why it is giving this error, null reference exception might be null. So you can put this question, but that is not, but that is for, right? Right? If this is not what you want to display, I want to display not available, right? So that is what I'm doing here, right? So in this case, you can see I'm projecting. See, in this case, I'm accessing the student. This is the outer data source. The first variable what you created, that will have a reference of the student. The second variable is going to be have a reference to the inner data source, right? So from this student and standard data source, right? Now I want to project the data to this type. So this student standard class, right? I think the student name, standard ID, standard, and all these things, right? Now, how you want to present the student name? I want to present the student name as student first name plus student last name. Suppose you are having one date of birth field, right? Then you can also calculate the age column here, right? You can create a method, calculate age. You need to call that method from here and pass that student without age, that is going to return the actual age of the student. That is also possible. That means you can also modify the data while returning to the client. So this is standard ID. I want to access from the standard table. Standard description, I want to access from the right standard table. And if standard description is null, I want to display not available, right? Student ID, I want to access from the student table. So, and once you do this, right, then you can use a loop and you can display the data. In without using this student standard entity, right, I can also, right, I can also project the data to an anonymous type, right? How? Right. So in this case, what I'm doing, I'm simply removing this. That is also going to work for me, right? So both are going to be work. So in this case, we are having a class. We are specifying that class, right? And in this case, we are projecting. But the difference is that in this case, if you misspell this name, you will get compilation error. but that is not in this case. So as you are projecting to anonymous type, whatever right property name you want as part of that anonymous object, you can specify, and you will not get any compilation or any any compile time error. But whatever name you specify, right, that is what you need to tell, right? For example, in this case, if I'm using this SMS2, then you can see the student name to property is giving me error. Means this anonymous object doesn't having this name, right? So the you will not get any runtime error, but if you modify this thing, you will also not get any compilation error, right? So this is how you can achieve by using this method syntax. In this case, this is a method, right? But if you are very good at what I can say SQL queries, in I generally prefer to use query syntax because I'm very good at SQL. So I prefer to use SQL query syntax, right? So in that case, whatever I'm going to do is, right? So what I'm trying to do is first right. It is similar to your SQL. Select star from student, join standard in join standard, and then we need to specify the on condition. Select a star from right student table and joining with the standard table, and here you can access the student data using the student variable, and you can access the standard data using the standard variable, and then you need to use the equals operator, right, on student dot standard id equals to standard dot standard id. So this is once completed, then you need to project the data either to an anonymous type or to a named types, right? So whatever you want, that what you can do here, right? So you can see I'm projecting the data to an anonymous type, and even if I want, then I can also project the data to a named type, right? A named type, something like this. So I can also project the data to a named type. So this is how you can perform the joining operations, right? And once you run the application, then you will see it is going to perform the joining operations. See, it is performing some left join, inner join, right? And again, it is going to perform the left join, inner join, right? So it is performing the joining operation to paste the data. So this is how you can perform joining operation using LINQ to entities. Clear, guys? Any question, guys, related to this syntax? Right. So in this case, what is how good you are into anonymous method, how good you are into lambda expression, how good you are in right anonymous object, right, anonymous function. So those is going to be come into the picture, right? In real time, you might not use those things, but whenever you are working with this kind of examples, those concepts will definitely come into the picture, right? So now what I'm going to discuss is I'm going to discuss one of the new feature which is introduced in .NET Core, which is not available in Entity Framework, right? So, for example, in this case, what I'm doing now, I can write some write method, right? So earlier I have shown you how to use the right, how you can make use of a parameter. Instead of a parameter, you can also make use of a function. So this function is going to return some data, and whatever data this function is written, that what I'm going to use this parameter, that is also possible. So this is the new things that what available in Entity Framework Core. Earlier this thing was not available. Again, in this case also you can see that the name Pranay is going to be used as the parameter for this function. Why Pranay? Because at runtime this get name method is going to return Pranay. Clear, guys?
Yeah. Right.
So this is all about how you can query. Tomorrow we are going to discuss three important concepts. One is eager loading, lazy loading, and explicit loading. So what do we mean by eager loading? What do we mean by lazy loading? What do we mean by explicit loading? When to use what? How to use them? What is the difference between them? Right? At what scenario we need to what type of loading? Right? All these things we are going to discuss. We discuss multiple level of loading, how you can load multiple related entities, multiple level of related entities, right? And even I'm going to discuss one real-time example by taking at least right 5 to 6 database table. I'm going to show you the example. Clear, guys?
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. Any question, guys, related to today's session? You can
No.
ask. Yeah.
Deferred. You said one concept there, deferred. So I would like to, if you could give some
What concept? What concept? Ask me.
deferred. You said deferred.
Default convention.
Yes.
So did you go through the course syllabus?
No, not right now. I don't earlier.
See, I have already told you everything I am going to discuss. What is the default convention entity framework, or how you can override this default convention using data annotation, how you can
No,
write
not that one.
content.
No, the one that will the start deferred one. Deferred, not a default one.
Okay, so the default execution and immediate execution, right?
Yes. Can you give some idea on that?
Okay, what is the difficulty understanding that concept? So in this example only I'm telling.
No, that is
So in
fine.
this
Here is fine.
no, here it fine means in this example the query is going to use default execution or immediate execution.
It's immediate one.
Immediate
list.
one. So
Yes.
if I remove this to list method, then what will?
Okay, so it's going to be deferred.
It is going to be default one. So whenever you access for the first time here, whenever you are accessing this property for the first time, where you are accessing using this for loop, then only this SQL statement, whatever this variable content, right, that is going to be executed. So what is the? I don't understand why. Is there any difficulty to
No,
understand
that
this
is
concept?
fine.
Right. So this is the same concept, right? Default execution and immediate execution. So based on your requirement, right? If you want to see what exactly the difference, what exactly the performance implication, right? You need to learn this concept differently using LINQ, right? If you go and check my LINQ course, right? LINQ tutorials videos or LINQ tutorials on my website, right? I have given, right, a very good detailed explanation, right, between these two concepts. Right?
Okay.
But here our main concept is not understanding, right, the LINQ concept. Our main objective here is how we can use the LINQ concept, right? And that is what I'm showing you some of the example. Yeah, these are the examples. And whenever those concept coming, I'm explaining that what we mean by default execution, what we mean by right immediate execution, right? So again, I'm explaining this concept, but those are specifically belongs to LINQ. Even this lazy loading, eager loading, right, explicit loading, right, it is completely dealing with our entity framework code. So definitely, I'm going to explain those concepts in detail, right? Whichever is part of our .NET Core, right? I'm going to explain those concepts in detail. But if it is not related to .NET Core, right? If it is something else like this LINQ, right? Even these are related to .NET Core, but without using .NET Core, you can also use LINQ. Right, so and it's not possible for me to explain the LINQ concept in detail because LINQ is also going to take at least 15 to 20 days.
Oh, that much of long.
Obviously, that was if you look at my LINQ, right? Where is
15,
my
20 days, that's long time.
so if you look at my LINQ, where is LINQ? Yeah. So you can see I have provided minimum 61 chapters related to LINQ.
That means one chapter one day that will take 15, 16 days at least.
Obviously, otherwise, and I can't take more than 3 to 4 chapters per day. Right, even that is also same thing is also happening with me. I'm targeting to discuss something else, but I'm not completed all the things whatever I'm planning. Right, so we are almost 3 days, and we have only completed 7 chapters. Right, and many advanced concepts are also this. I have prepared document for 30, but this list will be going till 40. 40 chapters are there minimum related to entity framework core.
So there is a separate class for LINQ, right?
No, I'm not going to take LINQ in this session. In this course, LINQ is not part of our course syllabus.
Okay. No, that is going to separate a course for that.
That is my C# concept, right? So if you look at my C# course syllabus, let me show you this thing, C# training, right? So this is part of my C#.
Okay.
Right, so that is part. Guys, any more question, guys, from anyone? Okay, thank you, guys.
Thank you.